Good afternoon. For those of you just joining us, I'm Linda Baker from the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. I hope you enjoyed your break and are here with us for as much of the afternoon as you can be. Our next presenter is Brianna Olson. Brianna is a social worker, diverse multimedia artist, and member of the Wikwemikong Unceded First Nation, currently undertaking her master's in social work through the Indigenous Trauma and Resiliency specialization at the University of Toronto. As an Indigenous woman and practitioner, Brianna has spent the last decade committed to supporting Indigenous families and other marginalized communities through the arts and harm reduction. She is currently residing in Toronto and developing a deeper understanding of trauma in the Masters of Social Work program, as well as focusing her energy on sharing her gifts of Indigenous artistry and leadership with the community. She is currently an avid volunteer. I have a feeling she's been an avid volunteer most of her life, lending her time and support to the University of Toronto First Nations House and the Walking with Our Sisters memorial installation, as well as fundraising for numerous important causes. Brianna has already received multiple awards for her work and her achievements. And I'm just going to mention one, the Human Rights Award, presented by the John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights in 2015. We are glad, Brianna, that you are sharing your gifts with us today, and we're going to turn it over to you.
Ani minigijgad Brianna Olson, Pidawanakot in addition to cause. Miskachi Waskahagan, Mina Toronto, Mina Wikwemikong Sing, Unceded First Nation, Didinjaba. Nishnabikwe Indao, Wabashishid, Indodem. Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. I would like to acknowledge this beautiful day that we've been blessed with. I also would like to introduce myself to you all. My name is Brianna Olson Pidawanakot. Pidawanakot is my Indigenous last name, which means between the clouds. I am a proud member of Wikwemikong Unceded First Nation, which is about 6 hours north of here on Manitoulin Island, which is the largest freshwater island on the entire planet, which is amazing. And I'm also had grown up in a place called Miskachi Waskahigan, otherwise known as Beaver Hills House, otherwise known as Edmonton, Alberta. So I grew up there my entire life. Spent lots of time in the Cree and Nakota Sioux communities, where I also have family that accept me and that I represent out in the community. I am also residing here in Toronto, otherwise known as Toronto, within the Haudenosaunee language, meaning trees standing in the water. And I am Anishinaabe, which means an Indigenous woman. I'm also a member of the Martin clan. It's important that when I'm presenting, I acknowledge all of those parts of myself because it is who it has made me who I am today, all of those different identities and places. And I also identify my clan because as an Indigenous Anishinaabe woman, the clan system is a system of governance that has existed within our communities for tens of thousands of years. As an Indigenous woman, I stand here with the knowledge of my ancestors, with the strength of my ancestors. And when I say, when I refer to the history of our people and the history of our governance systems, for the community of Wikwemikong Sing in particular, the history is now being dated back as far as 14,000 years. That is only the recorded history that scientists can date back, but in our culture we refer to it as time immemorial. So this is how long my ancestors have lived and thrived on this land with governance structures, with legal systems, with traditions, and fully functioning whole societies that had existed largely uninterrupted until the time of contact. and that are very strong in our communities today. So, yeah. Oh, language. So what she did was she just offered me tobacco. Within our teachings, tobacco is a sacred, the traditional tobacco we call sema is one of our traditional medicines. And when you are entering into agreement with somebody, you would offer tobacco. If you are asking for their wisdom or making some sort of arrangement with them, you would offer tobacco as an acknowledgement. So I very much appreciate that. Thank you. So throughout my presentation today, I will be sipping tea because my throat is very hoarse. I'm also teaching at the Ryerson University, so I have to go teach there this afternoon. Had a cold 3 weeks ago and it's still lingering just on my voice box, so I apologize in advance and I will give you that preface. So what I would like, as I said today, to, with this wisdom that I embody through an Indigenous lens, begin to explore the history of violence against women, all women, that exists within the society that we live in, and how that particular violence is largely overrepresented with Indigenous women in our communities today. So as my uncle says, we can look at our society through a lens that we've been given on an everyday basis, so Western Euro lens, but we can also look at our systems through an Indigenous lens. And this is what my uncle always encourages me to do. And I would like to invite every single person in the room that this lens is available to every single one of you. Our history books are, there's so much history that's available to you. All of the information that I'm sharing here today is readily available to the public. It is only up to you to be able to access that. So I'll begin. So the hidden narrative, consent in a colonial system. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Cindy Baskin, who's my supervisor at the University of at Ryerson University, and she was the one who had developed the slides that we'll be going through today. So prior to colonization, like I had mentioned, our societies were functioning. We had everything that we needed to live harmoniously amongst each other. The governance systems were full, and the legal systems were, every aspect of society that you see today it had existed at that time. And women in particular had a very, very, very central and important role to our communities. So as you can see with this quote, women had her specific responsibilities, including for the men, how they conducted themselves, how they behaved, how they treated her. She reminded them of their responsibilities, and she had to know when and how to correct them when they strayed from those responsibilities. With the gifts given to her, women were perhaps more important than men. That's from a Mohawk woman from the Mohawk Nation. You might otherwise hear the term Haudenosaunee, which is another way to reference how that community references themselves, and is from Marilyn Kane. Women inherently, and this is a term that I've heard time and time again in looking through history, historical documents, is women had title. What comes with title? Title is respect. There's a wealth that women had. Women had power within their communities. Women had very, very, very important roles that were central to the community, and they had very important leadership roles. I remember one of my teachers had told me, Eric Shirt from Cree Elder from out west, had said that one of the first misunderstandings between settlers and our communities was that when one of the first contacts had happened, the settler nations had said, "Take me to your leader. You know, we'd like to interact with your leader." They introduced them to the clan mothers. So the clan mothers are the grandmothers in our communities that make the decisions. They are the ones that define who is in a leadership role. If they are a man, they define all of the actions that are going to take place in the community, and they really are the decision makers. And the settler nations were offended by that, because at that time there was a very patriarchal system that had taken place over in Europe. There was a feudal system, there was a monarchy, there was different forms of leadership of that nature. So that was one of the first misunderstandings. The birth into family, territory, and spiritual world are experiences all of our community members have. There's very, very well-established spiritual beliefs that are inherent in all of our society, in our governance, in how we raise our children, who you are, how you come into this world. And there's a communal bond amongst all the people in the community, and that translates to a communal bond with nature as well. So that is that connection to the land, that connection to the deities that exist within nature as well. And in all of our prayers, even to this day, that is what we acknowledge. It's the land and the gifts that we receive from what we call Wikwemikong, or nature, Mother Nature. The membership function of a sense of belonging determined by each nation is on the basis of recognition, acceptance, and kinship. So you're not necessarily, you have a kinship that's very strong within your nations. That connection with other people and that connection with your community is the most important thing. You'll very much find that still existing today within our communities. Like I had said, even though I'm Anishinaabe from out this way, I have been adopted into Cree and Nakota Sioux families. So that sense of kinship and that sense of belonging is what holds our communities together. And there was no externally imposed definition of who could identify with a nation. So like I had said, like I had illustrated, is that membership could vary, it could wane, it could change, it was very fluid. And that sometimes people were adopted into nations, sometimes people left their nations and went to go and join other nations. And this is actually a reason I'm not standing behind this, because I can't not move. I have to be moving. I very much carry that spirit of traveling within my work. And the significance for women, as it was the women's identities that were attacked during colonization. It was a very, very strategic move by the government of Canada, who was not the government of Canada at the time, but by the leadership at that time to create policy that attacked women. And this is something that we're going to go through as the presentation unfolds. So colonization, the shattering of women's identities. So as I had mentioned, women, that title was inherent in who we were. That title was a birthright as a woman. You had a lot of power, and when that contact happened between settler nations and ours, that was not recognized. Very much that the roles of women were not acknowledged by the settler nations, and the churches, that layer was even stronger. So the Jesuits, who were steeped in patriarchy, actually complained about the lack of male control over women, that there was an issue that women were not being controlled by their husbands and by their communities. And it's interesting when you look at the historical documents, because you can see how the strategic disempowerment and disenfranchisement of women began, because trade traditionally always happened between women. Women were very much, like I had said, they had held the title. A lot of trade happened with women in other communities. Women had a lot of power, they had a lot of wealth. But when those settler nations left women out of that, they would only trade with the men. They would only communicate with the men. So women were just slowly kind of shifted out of those roles. Position and important roles of women were undermined by imported ideas and values that displaced and disvalued them, or devalued them. You only have to look at historical documents to see how degrading the language is around women. It is actually quite frightening. And you see a lot of that language playing today within our society. The destruction of many of our traditional governing practices and spiritual beliefs began to happen. and the disintegration of tribal structures that were clan-oriented, matriarchal, matrilineal, and based on the concepts of extended family and collectivity. So as I start to go in a bit of the policy, that was rolled out with the Indian Act and with enfranchisement and different practices like that. We'll see how policy began to strip away the rights, the inherent rights of women and the inherent place of women. Electoral systems shattered consensus, alienated community from decision making, and bred distrust. So with the imposition of something like the Indian Act, which was not our original governance structure, the idea of consensus was stripped from our communities. The idea of women in the clan mothers having the utmost ability to help guide the community in a good way was stripped from our communities. And this was all government policy that much of it still exists today. Women's views of herself as a person and views of nations about identity were never factored into the government policy that was developed to work with Indigenous people. One thing that I missed out on was one of the inherent legal terminologies or doctrines that allowed for settler nations to come to Canada or to come to what we refer to as Turtle Island and to take dominion over land. So land grabs had set the stage for what we see as modern Canada right now, and still continue to this day. There was a legal term that was called terra nullius. And terra nullius is a term that means nobody's land. So what was inherent within that terminology was that Indigenous people were viewed as not human or not evolved. So Indigenous people were looked at as not competent to be able to take care of their own land. So that legal doctrine allowed for the land grabs that happen. There's some brilliant legal studies that have come out of the University of British Columbia that looks at the doctrine of discovery, which goes hand in hand with terra nullius, and that much of our legal systems that we see today in Canada, the doctrine of discovery underlies all of that. So still to this day, Indigenous people are not seen as equals within the court systems. Women who married men without Indian status were disenfranchised, so they lost their status. They were no longer allowed to live in their communities in many cases, were had to go live somewhere else. So you could see that, again, this systematic undermining of the woman's role within the community. Despite having been born into the community, upon marrying out, she was no longer considered an Aboriginal person by Canadian government. So again, had lost the ability to even live in her community in many cases. Children of such marriages were not recognized as Aboriginal, and non-Aboriginal women who married a man with Indian status became, if a settler woman had married an Indigenous man, she actually gained status as an Aboriginal woman, whereas, and their children had status too, and whereas Indigenous women who married out of the community had lost their status altogether. I actually recently found out that my mom had married a non-native man, and she had actually lost her status. The government had decided that she was no longer a member of her community. So that's interesting. And she fought for it and she got it back, which is amazing. So the Indian Act, what we see today, the Indian Act is a federal policy that determines every aspect of the lives of Indigenous people within this country. It is one of, I believe, it may be the only country in the world right now who has race-based policy in their governmental. South Africa was one of them. They ended apartheid and that went away. Canada still continues with the Indian Act today. Myself am a status Indian, technically. under the Government of Canada and have a card that identifies me as so, and have been so since birth. And so as we continue, there we go. So categories of Aboriginality created through Canadian laws, as though Indigenous identity and rights can be chopped into compartments or completely taken out. So when we look at our original governance structures, we look at our original whole functioning communities, we see that there's been that systemic imposition within our communities, and that it's been defined by Canadian law with the Indian Act. Historical literature, although there is a lot of really, you have to be critical when you look at historical literature as well, recognizing that much of it was written by non-Indigenous men, and much of it was steeped in patriarchy and steeped in very unfair and inaccurate depictions, especially of Indigenous women. And much of the roles of Indigenous women were not recorded because they weren't seen as valid and they weren't seen as important. All right. So now we look at some of the really, really deeply rooted and deeply damaging policies that had taken place over the years with colonization. It's really interesting when you look at the history prior to the 1700s, because during that time, there were the concept of nation to nation. It's a very available term that's being used today in regards to Indigenous people and the Canadian government. That nation-to-nation relationship did exist to some degree at that time. Indigenous nations were looked at as very powerful. They were looked at as equal trading partners. Their governance was respected in some cases. There were talks that took place where settler nations would come into our lodges, or our Medewin lodges, into our longhouses, and it was very much looked at more equal, although women were definitely left out even at that time. But then it was around the 1800s that things began to become very aggressive in terms of absorbing Indigenous people into the larger narrative, into the larger society in Canada. So, and this was all, again, government policy that was legal. This was all done by the Canadian government. So colonization, attacks on children, residential schools caused immeasurable damage to our communities. So I myself am the first Indigenous woman in my family to reside at home with my mom. My grandmother had attended Spanish residential school. She was taken away from her family at a very young age to go there, suffered horrendous abuse when she was in there, and all of her siblings were adopted all across. Even one of them went to Europe. So the disconnection that happened and the rupture within the family system was significant. My mother grew up in Sault Ste. Marie and lived with nuns because there was nothing for her in the community. She had to leave the community and went to go live there and was raised by the church. So, but really imagine the severing and for a national policy to apprehend, like that is to apprehend children and to cause that disconnection in the family. It really is the worst thing that they could have done, because the impacts have been catastrophic to our communities, and they continue even today with a lot of the intergenerational trauma that you see in our communities. Colonization, attack on Aboriginal nationhood, we were stripped of our sovereignty. So again, under the Indian Act, you have no power. You have no rights, and you are very much, you would call it a paternalistic relationship where, and this is actually, it's interesting when you look at the history, Canada would be always referring to themselves as the big brother or the father of Indigenous people. So that began, that relationship became very skewed. Colonization, attacks on women, the United Church Sterilization Center. There were over 3,500 Indigenous women that were had forced sterilization in Canada, and that is most recently being reported now in Saskatchewan as early as 2 years ago, where Indigenous women have gone in to have children and had mastectomies without permission and or had been coerced into having mastectomies. Colonization, attacks on land, so relocations, where entire communities were moved to another part of the country, which caused drastic community changes. And in the research that me and Cindy are working on research right now around Indigenous women and girls and trafficking, and we're looking at the connections between violence against land, which is very much inherent and important to our Indigenous worldview, the connection between violence against women and the attack of the land. So when we look at things like really heavy resource extraction, you see that there is man camps that come up, and there is an increase in the labor force. There's an increase in men around community transient men, and there's a drastic increase in drugs and alcohol use and abuse that takes place. There's also a rise in rape and sexual violence in those areas. This is especially significant around the tar sands in northern Alberta, as well as the Bakken oil field in the United States. Globally, this is an issue that affects Indigenous women globally. We see that an increase in resource extraction or like mining or really heavy pollution, that those chemicals disproportionately target the reproductive organs of women, and that women are always the ones that have the highest casualties when there's, if we look at climate change, same thing, women are the ones that are facing the most casualties. And it's generally women of color and women from very disadvantaged communities. And if you look at some place like Fort Chipewyan in northern Alberta, there has been an increase in cancer, so bile duct cancer and different illnesses that have come from that. So the term overrepresentation is something that is really significant. Just give me one moment. So overrepresentation is an important word, and it's a word that is often accompanied by statistics and is used in post-secondary and when we're trying to illustrate the importance of an issue. But for me as an Indigenous woman, what does overrepresentation actually mean to me as a community member? Since the time that I have become an advocate in my community, I have seen nearly 10 women from my community and from across Canada either go missing or be murdered. These are women that are peers, these are women that are community members, these are young women. And this rings true for anybody that I work with in my community. I have had advocates who have had to step back from doing this work because they have been so traumatized by the ongoing violence that they see in their peer groups. One dear friend of mine who has led the missing and murdered women advocacy in Edmonton actually had 3 of her close friends murdered within 2 years while she had been doing that work. So that is what overrepresentation means. And when you're working in our communities, you see the impacts. And the idea of kinship is still very much alive in our communities. All of our governance structures are alive and well, although they have been very impacted by colonization. So the idea of kinship is so important, and you are affected when something like this happens. You are absolutely affected, and it is very intimate and it's very real. And the trauma and the kind of embedded trauma that just builds up and that traumatic loss is very taxing on our communities. I've also worked with clients who have had numerous, even close. I had one young girl that I worked with whose both mother and auntie were found within 5 miles of the city of Edmonton, who were both murdered. And so it is catastrophic. And that's what representation means to our communities, is that we are more impacted by this than the larger public. Canadian Aboriginal relations have provided the environment from which profound social and economic problems have taken root. This is years, and when we think back to it and we look at the history, it's hundreds of years of purposeful and systemic deprivation and oppression within our communities. Indigenous peoples are only 4% of the Canadian population, but women are overrepresented as victims and too often targeted because of gender and race. Almost 1,200 women and girls have gone missing or been murdered, although the number is estimated to be upwards of 4,000 today since the initial count. Thousands more die from suicide and premature violent deaths. Many women still find that their children are being taken from them because of neglect and substance abuse. Those are the two issues that are the main reason for why children are being apprehended from families. Both issues are rooted in historical trauma. Indigenous women are incarcerated more than Indigenous men. 90% increase in the past decade in terms of how many Indigenous women are being incarcerated in this country. They're the fastest growing inmate population. Indigenous women, again, and this is all areas in which Indigenous women are overrepresented. You see it across the board. Indigenous women are overrepresented in so many areas, in homelessness, and are also being trafficked. So why is this happening? Why does this continue to perpetuate within our society? Again, we look at the term terra nullius, that Indigenous women are not human, or that we're less than, or that we are inferior. And with that goes the idea that we're disposable. Brutal victimization is justified because victims are stigmatized and stereotyped. Societal indifference. That's something that I'll get to at the very end. How we can kind of start to address that indifference that a lot of people have. It's not my issue. It's not a big deal to me. It doesn't affect me. Turning a blind eye. Signals to the public that crimes against us do not matter, making our experiences of violence invisible or sensationalized. So quite often you'll see media is very problematic in terms of how they look at Indigenous women and how our stories are told. If a person is judged to have deviated from patriarchal notions of appropriate behavior, they are constructed as at least partially responsible for the violence. We look at the recent case of Tina Fontaine, who was a 15-year-old girl, a child, who was exploited by men who were significantly older. They're in their 50s and 60s, and she was murdered before she had been experienced statutory rape. And the media headline during her trial was Tina Fontaine had drugs and alcohol in her system before she died. We're talking about a kid whose one of her parents had been brutally murdered, a kid who had grown up in child welfare system, a kid who had been severely traumatized, and that's the headline that they chose, rather than focusing on obviously the man who had murdered her, who, by the way, had gotten off completely scot-free. There was no charges. He had been acquitted and had gone free without any charges. So where does the media get their information? Where does the public get their information? The public is mainly getting their information from media, and media is not doing our communities justice right now. Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, and trans people are so often depicted in the news as blameworthy. They're looked at as deserving of the crime, or that they asked for it, or that they put themselves in a negative situation. Media reports do not situate conditions in a relevant socio-historical context. there's no context. And the larger Canadian public has very little context into all of the things that I had just mentioned in terms of the history of this country. And that socialization exists from birth. Our education system is severely lacking when it comes to educating the public on the history of this country. This blames and obscures the unequal social conditions and which shapes choices. Hence, the public is left with the idea that our challenges stem from cultural inferiority and that we have no ability to fit into society. This is a dominant, prevalent, normalized notion of Indigenous people in this country. This photo was taken in Edmonton at a community vigil for Tina Fontaine, a 15-year-old girl whose body was found in the Red River in Winnipeg in 2014. 53-year-old Robert Cormier was charged with her murder nearly a year later. Tina was a member of the Saugeen First Nation in the care of child welfare in Winnipeg and a victim of exploitation. Tina Fontaine's social worker knew that she was in the company of an old man who showed signs of exploiting and grooming, and her social worker did nothing. The police picked up Tina on a missing persons report days before her death and let her go. No one looked for her when she went missing for days. Indigenous girls overrepresented in child welfare, they receive inequitable, culturally uninformed service and find themselves in systems complicit in their harm. That is illustrated by Tina's story. Tina's tragic story. To further illustrate the kinship in our communities is actually one of the women standing off to the side who was drumming for Tina Fontaine's vigil was the sister of Colton Boushie, who had another young person in our community who had been murdered. So this speaks to the advocacy that's going on within our own communities right now, the grassroots efforts to address some of these issues. Again, there's an overrepresentation of Indigenous women that are missing or murdered. Thousands more die through suicide and premature violent deaths. And there's also many premature violent deaths that are listed as suspicious, but they fit the criteria in many cases for being murdered, but they don't officially get that designation. My adopted family had their daughter meet a very violent end in Toronto, and her death is listed as suspicious, but it's very clear that she was likely murdered. So that's a very good example of that as well. The Native Women's Association of Canada, NWAC, mounted the campaign for a national inquiry several years ago. It was Tina Fontaine's passing that had been one of the large mitigators for that. Sisters in Spirit, No More Silence, Who Is She, Walking with Our Sisters, report an urgent state regarding the safety of Indigenous women and girls. The government does little to change the status quo that marginalizes women through structural inequalities, and the violence takes place in this public sphere. Many Canadians are unaware of how Indigenous women are systematically targeted, and societal indifference. Our lifestyles are looked at as putting us at risk, but it's something you're born into. This is something my friend Tanya Capo had said. She's an Indigenous lawyer. She said, it doesn't matter how far I climb the economic ladder, how successful I am. The moment I walk out the door, simply because I'm an Indigenous woman, I'm more likely to be murdered than any other woman in this country. So what can we do? Every single person in this room has access to this TRC report, the Truth and Reconciliation report. I would encourage you to take a look at it. There's specific calls to action around journalism and media, and specific calls to action around the issue of Indigenous women and violence. And resistance. So what are we doing right now in our communities, or what are some things that you can do practically as workers in the community and potentially working alongside Indigenous women? Assessing a woman's safety while reminding her that she is powerful. And again, that power is something that has been stripped from our communities. And it's been stripped from all of us. That is the Western, like this settler kind of dominant society that we live in right now. It has impacted all of us. And we know that as women, we know that as Two-Spirit people, we know that as trans people. Service providers need to look at a woman's situation from all imaginable angles. You have to understand the historical context. Critical lens, cultural competency, and an anti-oppressive framework. And looking at gifts, strengths, gifts, and survival. How has a woman got to this place this far? And how has she coped with and resisted both the abuse and also the discrimination, because we have to look at the system as being a perpetrator of that discrimination as well. Women need to hear traditional teachings, and this is where all of us have a responsibility to build relationships with Indigenous people in your communities. Blue is a good example of that, is an amazing advocate for our communities and was generous enough to come here and share her teachings with all of you. And there's very much people in your communities that are doing that work. So get to know them, understand, and have them as a resource available for Indigenous women you work with. In this way, they will come to understand that they were never considered inferior in our own communities until the things had kind of turned sideways, and that they are important and valued. Reviewing the effectiveness of your programs. Do they work with Indigenous people? Are they accessible to Indigenous people? Women need to feel secure and safe enough to walk through the door. Are they represented at your agency or where you're working? Women need to know that workers will be helpful and supportive, and it is through this relationship. Relationship is the most important thing in our communities, that kinship, having that reciprocal, having responsibility to the people that you're serving. So that relationship is key. And true safety comes from community, from diverse people creating an inclusive vision for safety, and then also confronting your own bias. Even as an Indigenous person, I was indoctrinated to think these things about my own people. I was raised in the system. I had a lot of things that I had to work through as a social worker, and I think that's very much true for everybody in this room. It takes an immense amount of courage to be able to address those biases. We need to work towards making ending violence against women a priority in our society. Addressing poverty. We know that poverty is a huge indicator for our women in our communities, and making sure programs are accessible to our most vulnerable. Providing opportunities, changes in education, so that we can include an accurate picture of history and that people feel like their identities are valued, right? Educating all Canadians about the truth of the history. And that even involves, I've had a group of grade 3 students like all put their hands up when I asked, does anyone know what a residential school is? I was like shocked. And they knew everything. There was no sugarcoating it. It was amazing. Empowerment. Don't ask Indigenous people to educate you about colonization. Educate yourself and people like you. Information is readily available. It's incumbent upon you to endeavor for that truth. Resolve contradiction at the heart of this country by restoring Indigenous nations to the place of honor in history and recognizing our continued presence and participation in Canadian life. Indigenous people aren't going anywhere. I think that's become pretty clear in the last few years. We're not going anywhere. We are here, we have always been here, and we are very strong. And we are going to continue to assert who we are within this country. Critical self-reflexivity. Believe when somebody tells you something is problematic. When somebody tells you something is racist or discriminatory, please open your mind and be able to listen to that. Count your privileges. Don't be defensive. Even as an Indigenous woman, I have privilege. I'm educated. I have money. I have, freedom of movement. I have, I'm straight. I'm cisgendered. Like, I have a lot of privilege, and I can count my privilege, right, in front of people. And this is one of the last, so again, some other tips, and this is one of the last really important points that I want to make. This is something that Roberta Jameson had said. She's the first Indigenous woman lawyer in all of Canada. She's a Haudenosaunee woman. She said, non-Indigenous people often say that they are not responsible for what happened in the past several centuries. but we are all responsible for what happens today. These deeply rooted social inequalities are our responsibility as a society to take care of. If not, we will leave these problems bred by prior governments for our next generation. Do we want to leave these issues for our children? What responsibility are we taking today to address these issues? Miigwech. Thank you.
You mentioned Tina Fontaine, and we've been following that tragedy for some time now in the media and its ongoing evolution. And you talked about the headlines. In your opinion, what's the best way Canadians can challenge the racism against Indigenous people in the media?
I would say hold them accountable. So the day that, and this is one lesson that I learned very quickly as I was coming into social activism and social work. If we don't do it, no one else is going to do it. We have to do it. Like, we have to, as a human being, you have to be responsible. If you see something wrong, you have to say something, or you have to bring it up, or whatever you can do in your position to affect change. I know for that specific headline, it was done by the Globe and Mail. And so what I did quickly was I wrote a letter to the editor of Globe and Mail, admonishing him for what he had approved, and then wrote a letter to all of the major media outlets, because what they had done was they had copied and pasted that same headline to all of their media outlets. And there are specific mention within the TRC, and this is something that would be great if people wanted to look up a resource to quote. Like, here's what the TR says about reconciliation with Indigenous people in media. Like, why aren't you doing this? Like, holding our media outlets accountable. One other problematic thing that has been recurrent, and it's still happening, is that they are using terminology like Tina was dumped in the river. Somebody who is murdered, somebody who, a young girl especially, like, it is just, this language is so problematic because it's so dehumanizing, right? What do you, like, the term dumped, like, where do you use that? Use that for your garbage. Like, that's so, it's just dehumanizing, right? And for people who are in the community traumatized by this, to have to see that over and over again, they changed the headline the day after. Globe and Mail changed the headline. There was an amazing article that was written about it in the Globe and Mail by one of the op-ed writers who had, they totally said that we did this, and that Tina is still being dehumanized and she's being disrespected even in her death, like, that this is continuing, right? So they were accountable, but definitely, I think holding our media outlets accountable for that kind of thing is important.
Okay, one more question?
Sure.
All right. You spoke of the profound trauma and traumatic loss experienced by Indigenous peoples and communities. What are some of the ways that allies can support the healing and the rewriting of narratives?
I think that, so for myself right now, I'm doing an Indigenous trauma and resiliency specialization. It's looking at the impacts of historical trauma and just all types of trauma on our bodies, on how we interact and on our communities. There are very significant impacts that exist, that are measurable. For example, like, this program was taken up by the University of Toronto. That in itself is important, right? For having in our educational spaces, to have this education brought in, to have it embraced, to have it honored with space. And I think that very much rings true for other places in the country, in your workplace. I worked in Edmonton for a non-Indigenous organization, an arts organization that did harm reduction and trauma-related work with youth. It was through, partway working there, I was like, 70% of our clients are Indigenous. Like, why don't we have an Indigenous framework? So I developed one. But it was through the support of my agency that I was able to do that, so that Indigenous people could feel represented when they walked in the door, so that our youth could have culturally relevant support. So yeah, so I think it's really offering up spaces to our community, and being generous with that. And I think in some, we get into a very territorial thing, especially like if you're working in the helping sector and nonprofits, but we all know that when you work in collaboration, partnership, we get way more done, right? We can go a lot further for our community members. So I think that's important, and that's a way of, and listening. Listening is our first, within our teachings, that's our first most important gift that we have to honor. So listening to the people in your community. What is going on? What do they need? What is being said? What is being asked for? So how can you, I think that's a good start. Yeah. Thank you.
So all of our presenters today have highlighted the necessity of discussing and addressing colonialism and racism. Brianna, I think you provided us with some really important teachings around that, some further considerations and actions that we can take, ways in which we can be responsibility. And I can say for myself, and I think for those in the chat box and those in the room, your strength has really inspired us and provided us with some courage. So miigwech, thank you.